All right, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining this panel, this workshop discussion with Professor Luc Turgeon. We have, the way we envision this session is for it to be as interactive as possible, and so we'd like to actually start the session by inviting questions from the audience, if there are any to begin with.
Sure. Hi. I am very interested in how voting for minorities and how to get that in greater numbers, because as you had mentioned, there are so many obstacles to democratizing minority voters. I've worked a lot, volunteered a lot in youth, with youth, and I'm wondering, right now, you had mentioned earlier today that a big part of the disengagement in minorities is because the youth don't vote, and they're in huge numbers. And from the volunteer work I've done in schools, there's a lot of presidential councils. It's really based on an American-style politics. Do you think if we introduce something like parliamentary-style politics in schools, where they have an opportunity to see how our system works, would that generate more excitement with young people? And could that be a way of bridging some of this?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, and as any good academics, I'm usually good at figuring how things work, and maybe less so what we should do after that. So your perspective is likely as good. So I don't want to pretend that I have sort of solution. And actually, I think what Sarah mentioned is something I fully agree. Which I didn't think we would be in such a big room, and I thought we'd be maybe like around sort of a table, and we could have. This is not the best sort of venue to have a conversation, but. I mean, what I'm going to say is sort of based on personal experience as much as you, but maybe sort of linked to some of our study. I mean, clearly, we know that people who don't have sort of a sense of, or don't have a knowledge of the institution, don't know how institutions work, don't have a feeling of political efficacy, are less likely to vote, and we certainly found that in our study. So clearly. I think, and it's sort of striking, and I've seen that among my own students, that they understand the American electoral or the American political system better at times than their own system. So I would absolutely agree, and I think there's interestingly enough, I do a lot of my research with Antoine Bilodeau, and Antoine has started a sort of a project, or has done a pilot project in his own sort of kids class. They go to an alternative school, so obviously there's a lot of alternative stuff they do. But one of is sort of basically learning about, and I think they were in grade 4 actually, learning some of the basics. And there's a lot of experiments like that that are working. So ultimately, I think, based on some evidence we have, that absolutely getting or promoting a better knowledge of the way our institutions work is likely to sort of improve participation. Now, at the end of the day, there's also an issue of making politics interesting, of having significant societal debates in our country. And clearly I said earlier when I was intervening that the sort of literature is mixed on the impact of negative campaigning, but that literature, I'm not sure if it looks specifically how it impact young voters. Maybe Aaron or some other political scientists have better knowledge of that literature than I do. But at least, it might be worth exploring whether that be the case. And I mean, obviously, on sort of a very anecdotal basis, that's what, every year when I teach sort of my introductory course or my introduction to Canadian politics, and I have this discussion with my students, and those are people that are in political science. You would expect them to be very motivated to vote, but they have a sense of disengagement because, to an extent, the sort of feeling that Canadian politics is boring, or Canadian politics is all about fighting or infighting. But I think for me, what is often striking, this term, I was teaching an introduction to Canadian politics, and I couldn't believe how much time I had to just explain to my student that we didn't vote for the prime minister. You know? So those kinds of things is always sort of surprising to me.
Sorry, just want to add just to that for one quick second. Would we benefit by learning civics at a younger age, like, you know, high school and younger? Because I'm a political student myself at Carleton in the Masters in Political Management program, and to be honest, this is the first time I've ever learned about how our political system works. And I'm in a master's program. I didn't learn about it in my undergrad, and you know, because it's specialized, and I certainly didn't learn about it in high school. So would learning about it in the younger years help bring up this more voter engagement then?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I'm trying to remember, I think Henry Milner sort of wrote a book on engagement and sort of was looking at the Scandinavian case. I mean, it's a bit far now. I'm trying to remember some of his finding, but I think one of his key finding was the extent to which youths in Scandinavia had very strong sort of civics teaching, very good knowledge of their own political system, and that had a sort of a positive impact on their likelihood of voting. So absolutely. I mean, I think I kind of joke about that because it's when political scientists write books or report, and at the end they have to write proposal. They always put improving civics. It's kind of the easy one to write, but it's true. It is significant and important. So. I should know, now that I've lived so many years in Ontario, what sort of the civic education curriculum in Ontario and which year it's taught, but I don't. I still have my grade 10, and I don't know. I was raised in Quebec, obviously, and I went to school in Quebec, so I have no idea the extent to it. But in Quebec, one of the things I found that was interesting is that, or actually the school I went to, is we didn't really have a civics class as far as I remember, but we had a lot of sort of history class because, you know, je me souviens, obviously. So we have to remember all the time about that we were defeated on the plain of Abrahams, obviously. So, but we were like constantly being reminded. Not only that's the thing. I mean, I think the issue is, yes, civics are important, but I think it's also sort of expanding that knowledge in a number of areas beyond just civics.
I think that, so we have evidence that the more politically interested people are, the more they are likely to vote. And so one would expect that if we manage to increase political interest via civics, then we should expect to have more electoral participation among youth. But I guess your point also raises the question on whether, when we decide to focus just on electoral participation to measure political participation for youth or for visible minorities, then the question rises as to whether we are actually focusing on the right measure, and if we decided to focus on different, more informal ways of, or dimensions of political participation, whether we would find different results. And
would we?
Well, I have some preliminary evidence that second-generation immigrants in the city of Toronto, for sure, tend to engage more in informal politics, such as protests or demonstrations, than to vote. They are not politically disengaged. In fact, they know a lot about politics, and they care about politics. They just decide to express their political interest in a way that is different from the one that we consider when we just focus on casting a ballot.
Although, I think Alison Errol and some of our collaborators a couple of years ago also did a study on Indigenous youth, and what was interesting is they find those two were connected also. If young people were involved in sort of unconventional political protests, they were also, interestingly, in their study, more likely to involve in conventional politics. But those were data for young Indigenous Canadians that she found there was a relation between the two.
One finding in your report is that a youth in Canada seems to have less confidence in Elections Canada than older Canadians, and that seems to exert a significant role on their likelihood to not participate. Yeah.
This is one of those findings that we have no idea why, to an extent, but it was sort of striking because we wrote that report for Election Canada, so they asked us to have a question about confidence in Election Canada, and so we did find actually that people who had less confidence in Election Canada were less likely to vote. I'm not sure why exactly. I mean, I'm not sure what's the relationship and sort of the direction of the relationship, but clearly what we know is that they had, they have less confidence in general in institutions, and including Parliament, including their provincial legislatures also.
Hi. My question was mainly trying to gauge your opinion on the idea that maybe low voter participation amongst immigrants or visible minorities has to do with their interactions with the institutions, political institutions, or the institutions that regulate their material and social lives. So, for example, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a new phenomenon, but even like with the Quebec referendum back in the day was about the ethnic vote and money. This past election, there was interesting discussion about the niqab. You mentioned different kinds of participation in Toronto, and I know in Toronto, having done my undergrad in Toronto, a lot of issues surrounding the experience that black men faced in terms of their interactions with the police, carding being a big issue, a lot of mobilization happening around carding with the Liberal government sort of making changes, but I know that a lot of people felt that it didn't go too far. And if you thought that maybe this sort of feeling of either being scapegoated or constantly disenfranchised by the institutions that you interact with that represent sort of the political sphere make you less inclined to participate. And I had just one comment, and I thought it was interesting that you mentioned extending the franchise at a municipal level to non-citizens, because I can tell you, I am now a citizen, but I came as an immigrant for my undergraduate degree, and I had no interest in Canadian politics because I had no entry point, right? So even though I studied political science and had my one prereq in Canadian politics that I needed to take, the rest I didn't focus on any Canadian politics courses, and it was only until my master's in public policy and then on that I sort of, as a result of being able to vote and felt more invested. So. But that's more of a comment, not really a question, I guess. No,
so I was excited to jump on your first question just because I've been doing a lot of research on Quebec, obviously. So Quebec is really interesting because actually I didn't mention that during the discussion, but visible minorities in Quebec are more likely to participate and vote than in other provinces. And it's actually sort of consistent with, for example, some observation in France after the controversial 2004 legislation there to ban young women from wearing the headscarf in school. So sometimes actually it has a backlash effect in some ways, and not backlash effect, that's not what I want to say, but it actually, when minorities are being confronted, it actually mobilizes them to mobilize politically. Where it has a huge impact, and I'm going to do just a very sort of plug that next week we have a report coming out that's going to be published by the Institute of Research on Public Policy on visible minorities' view of the Canadian Federation in 4 provinces, and especially their attachment to their own province. Right? So that's one of the key. And what's really striking is how visible minorities in Quebec right now have a very low attachment to Quebec, much lower than the attachment of visible minority in other provinces to their own province. And you know, clearly our report, our survey, it wasn't ideal, but our survey was done around the time of the debate on the charter in Quebec, so early 2014. And clearly we could see it in our result having a very negative impact. And some of that's not my work, that's Antoine's work, but Antoine's work has also shown that feeling of discrimination, of having been discriminated against, has a very negative attitudes toward feelings of belonging to Canada or to your province, actually. And so there's clear evidence to that. So I think in terms of the experience of discrimination of minorities, at least what we see in our some of the research we've done was that, especially with regard to the Quebec debate and the niqab debate, I'm not sure it necessarily sort of put or meant that a visible minority were less likely to vote, but I think it certainly have an impact on their sense of belonging, especially in Quebec. It had a profound, I think I would say a profound impact.
And this is actually quite interesting, especially when we start linking visible minorities and youth issues, because there is evidence that second generations tend to report discrimination more than first generation, which isn't to say that they are discriminated against more. They probably know how to identify discrimination better. And so the fact that they might receive more discrimination and the fact that it's negatively associated with with sense of belonging in Canada might jeopardize even further their ability to participate electorally.
Absolutely. I think Sarah worked with Keith Banting, who did a very good article with Stuart Soroka on that specific issue. And what was striking is especially how second generation in Quebec specifically, well, because that was what had very sort of worse views in some ways than the first generation. And actually, one of the things about Quebec, talking about first and second generation in our report that we're presenting next week, is that really what's unique about Quebec is that when we look at British Columbia and Alberta, there's significant difference for the first generation between sort of people who are not visible minorities and visible minorities, first generation immigrants, in terms of their views of the working of the Canadian Federation, the way they identify. But for the second generation, there barely is any difference. So, you know, there's clearly the process of socialization is such that they adopt, for example, the same discourse then of like Albertans that have regional grievances. The second, you know, so second generation immigrants really sort of adopt this language. And it's like this everywhere in the sort of 4 biggest provinces except Quebec. And Quebec, the first generation's differences remain with the second generation, which was sort of striking in our study. Now, in terms of maybe to link that to your comment, Sarah and I, or Sarah was mentioning just before we started, we were talking about in terms of allowing non-citizens to vote. I think Sarah was reminding me about the case of Brampton, of being an interesting example, and sort of, Sarah might want to talk a little bit about it, but I think...
just talking about the underrepresentation of visible minorities, particularly in the suburban areas of the Greater Toronto area that are home to the largest proportion of visible minorities, and Brampton has around, if I'm not mistaken, 61% visible minority population and 0 visible minority candidates in the local council. In the city council. And so obviously in those areas, being allowed to vote, even if you're not a citizen yet, might make a change. But I think linking back to the point that you made earlier on about, you know, your first experience as an immigrant to Canada, I think sometimes we have very lofty ambitions as to the level of political engagement that we expect, particularly of newcomers. So when I ask, for example, newcomers to Canada, what they feel about Canadian politics, I often get the response that politics or engaging in politics is a luxury for them, because in the first few years after immigration, people's main goal is to economically and socially settle. And so I think that it's sometimes lofty of us to expect that people will want to come to Canada and just, you know, be so adamant to become substantive citizens right away, right? So it's also about moderating our expectations about how quickly that process of political integration will happen.
Marc Renaud, je vis présentement en Europe, au Portugal en particulier, et je suis frappé de l'émergence d'une toute nouvelle forme de minorité, qui sont des jeunes gradués universitaires sans emploi. Ça atteint 25-30% en Espagne, 20-25% au Portugal, 20% en France. C'est titanesque. Quelle est la conséquence potentielle de ça sur la participation électorale? On peut, soit que les gens deviennent aliénés et ils s'attendent à la révolution, soit que ça tourne vers l'extrême droite, ce qui semble le cas en France, soit qu'ils tournent vers l'extrême gauche, qui est le cas au Portugal présentement. Qu'est-ce qui va arriver? Ce n'est pas encore le cas au Canada. On n'a pas des taux aussi élevés de chômage chez les jeunes gradués. Mais quand ça se produit, ça doit avoir un impact électoral, non?
Ben, oui, dans la mesure où on sait habituellement qu'il y a un lien, entre autres, entre le revenu disponible ou le taux le fait d'être sans emploi ou avec emploi sur la propensité à voter. Donc, oui, à cet effet-là, ça peut avoir un effet négatif, et surtout quand les pourcentages sont aussi élevés qu'en Europe du Sud. En France, bien entendu, ça peut créer une certaine radicalisation, parce qu'on sait aussi, là je parle à la lumière du rapport qu'on a écrit et d'autres recherches qu'on a fait, c'est que les attentes qu'ont les gens par rapport à leur futur, en particulier leur futur économique, ça a un impact considérable sur leur vision du pays dans un premier temps et leur capacité à participer. Donc, bien entendu, quand on parle du Portugal ou de l'Espagne, c'est des taux extrêmes. Hein? Je veux dire, clairement, au Canada, le marché de l'emploi est tel que même si hein, c'est plus difficile pour la jeune... C'est beaucoup plus... Moi, je suis un membre de la génération X, même si pendant des années, on a chialé contre les baby boomers. Je veux dire, notre situation, finalement, économique, je pense, était moins pire que celle qu'on envisageait quand on était plus jeune. À un moment donné, il y a des postes qui se sont libérés. Mais c'est beaucoup plus difficile pour la jeune génération, mes étudiants qui sortent présentement. Cela étant dit, je m'inquiète moins à ce niveau-là, même si, encore une fois, comme je l'ai mentionné, il y a des problèmes au niveau de certains sous-groupes, mais dans l'ensemble, les jeunes Canadiens, le problème n'est pas de la participation politique, ce n'est pas un problème principalement lié à la situation économique. C'est vraiment un problème, à mon avis, de socialisation politique, du fait que si, on le sait, Paul Howe, un autre collègue politologue, l'a démontré dans son ouvrage sur le vote des jeunes, si les jeunes ne prennent pas l'habitude rapidement hein, de commencer à voter dès les 2 ou 3 premières élections, c'est quelque chose qui va les suivre pour le restant de leur vie. Hein. Donc, il faut accrocher très rapidement les jeunes. C'est un de nos buts. Hein, bien, je pense que c'est un but valable, bien entendu, de s'assurer que les jeunes participent au processus démocratique. Donc, il faut clairement faire en sorte que très rapidement, ils votent, qu'ils prennent l'habitude de voter, parce que sinon, ça devient, malheureusement, le non-vote devient une habitude. Donc, je pense que la situation canadienne au niveau économique est très différente, bien entendu, mais il ne faut pas, comme je l'ai mentionné, il ne faut pas être complaisant. Et les taux de participation, j'ai bien hâte de voir les données, lorsque les données seront disponibles, quel aura été le taux potentiel de participation des jeunes à la dernière élection. J'espère que ça a augmenté. Je pense qu'il y a eu des réformes qui ont été mises en place, entre autres pour faciliter le vote sur les campus universitaires. D'ailleurs, une des trouvailles de notre rapport sur les jeunes que Sarah a mentionné, qui était vraiment étrange, parce que une des premières fois on voyait ça, on voyait que chez les 18 à 30 ans, ceux qui étaient aux études avaient une propensité à voter moins. Hein, habituellement, on pense que plus on est éduqué, plus on vote. Mais la faible participation électorale des jeunes universitaires nous avait énormément surpris. On ne sait pas exactement pourquoi, mais donc, clairement, il y a des problèmes actuels, mais dans l'ensemble, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, il ne faut pas se taper trop dans le dos, mais par rapport aux jeunes, clairement, la situation ici est beaucoup moins problématique qu'en Europe du Sud.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Gorman, and I'd like to talk a bit, or ask you to talk a bit more about political engagement beyond voting. There's an assumption in the notion of political and civic engagement that people believe in something larger than themselves, otherwise they wouldn't engage. And so I'd be curious to know in either of your research if there's any links that have shown up around the cultural value around the value of community that in any way connects to this notion of political and civic engagement.
Sarah, do you want to say?
So, I'm sorry, just to clarify the question though, I missed the first part because I was still listening to the French. What kind of community are you referring to in your question?
I'm talking more about the value of community. So for instance, in Chinese culture, the benefits and the well-being of the group is of higher value than the well-being of the individual. So I'm looking to know if there's anything in your experience or your research that talks about if a group holds cultural, values community, does it in any way shape their political or civic engagement?
So there are some anecdotes that some South Asian communities see political participation as a benefit for the community, and there is some anecdotal evidence that that's one of the reasons why South Asians tend to be particularly or better represented than other visible minorities. I haven't seen much literature that looks at what you are talking about. I have seen more literature on the non-electoral engagement of immigrants. Certainly much more literature on the non-electoral participation of immigrants in Europe than in North America, and certainly more in the US than we have in Canada. When it comes to looking at political participation in a very broad sense, so civic participation, so joining associations, there isn't much of a difference between different population groups and their likelihood to join. But that's, not politics with a capital P, it's politics with this lowercase p. When it comes to protest, the evidence seems to suggest that second-generation immigrants tend to, everything else being held equal, more likely to engage in that kind of informal politics than first generation, and that generally immigrants from non-democratic countries tend to have lower likelihood to engage in protests than those that come from more democratic countries. I suspect that there might be some country of origin effects or cultural effects as well, where people were socialized in political cultures that don't see protest as a way of expressing public issues or concerns, but I am unable to actually provide hard evidence for any of that. When it comes to contacting politicians or writing letters to politicians to raise awareness on issues, in my own experience, I've certainly seen that those behaviors tend to happen among immigrant communities, and they tend to happen particularly for people who are members of ethnic organizations. So generally, when people congregate around immigrant organizations or ethnic organizations, as we call them, although that might be a very bad term, generally political information, lowercase p as well as capital P tends to circulate more easily, and so people are more likely to become involved. So that's another argument for the importance of supporting immigrant organizations. But yeah, so there is evidence that there are differential levels of engagement in non-formal politics depending on where people are originally from.
I mean, one thing I might say about this issue, based on the report that we wrote on this question, is, I mean, we didn't necessarily have those kinds of questions, but one of the, and maybe it's just because I'm Catholic and I know the power of guilt, and that we had one of those questions, but actually one of the strongest predictor of whether people vote or not in our survey was whether they would feel guilty about not voting. That was huge. It had a huge effect. So, I mean, it doesn't directly respond to your question, but I think clearly, it shows the importance of, I mean, if you're going to feel guilty, it's because you feel guilty toward a community to an extent, toward your community, toward your country. But clearly, in terms of culture, I mean, that was a huge factor in our study, which, I mean, we kind of expected in some ways, but the strength of the relationship was really, really strong, which that surprised us how important. So I'm not sure what's the message to Election Canada, whether it's try to guilt young people into voting and saying you're a terrible person if you don't vote. Maybe we can experiment with some ads to that effect, something a bit more edgy, and say you're a terrible person if you don't vote. But clearly that has a huge impact.
I just had a question when you're talking about minorities, if you're including disabled people or if you've done any work particularly around disabled people in that. So obviously it's a very diverse group who would be visible minorities and not a sizable population who face a lot of issues and barriers around participation in general, and even then very concrete accessibility issues for the very act of voting.
Yeah, I don't know much about that, I have to be honest. And in fact, we had this conversation earlier on that it's in a way unfortunate that they place two people that both deal with immigration on the same panel that speaks about minority participation. Because, of course, our expertise is limited to just one particular kind of minority. Unfortunately, I don't know much. I do know that there is a recent trend that looks at health and political participation and pregnancy and political participation. I'm sure there must be literature on disability and political participation, but I'm not privy to it.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, and it's always when you do kind of research and you have a certain amount of resources, and especially that kind of research where you have to oversample, you need to have a large enough sample, can be a challenge. And so yes, I don't know the answer to your question. But I mean, some other research I've done on representation one thing I can say is that even if, when I did, in previous life, I did work on bureaucratic representation of minorities, and one of the things we have to be careful is, which is sort of weird for someone who's done those kinds of studies to say, but we have to go beyond the number, and partly because, for example, if you look at the representation of disabled people within the civil service in Canada, I mean, the numbers are sort of fairly reflective of their share of the population, but that doesn't say much about where they are sort of in the bureaucracy, for example, where, which rank they're being represented, so on and so forth. So this is something that I find very interesting. It'd be interesting to explore, not only the political participation, but obstacles that they have to overcome for political participation. But I also, I don't have enough information about this situation.
Yeah, because even with a specific focus on immigrants, it could be really interesting, to look at that cohort. Although with our restrictive immigration for disabled people, it's probably, actually a very small number of people in that group.
Yes, I agree.
I wonder if you could comment on your thoughts about how the ethnic vote went in this election in the context of the issues of micro-targeting versus whether micro-targeting was any use at all. And let me just tell you what I'm thinking about. On the one hand, you've seen parties, and if you just look at what has been said and written extensively about Jason Kenney, reaching out to communities, spending a lot of time with a number of communities, going to endless numbers of churches and temples and synagogues and all that. You look at the Prime Minister with foreign dignitaries like the Prime Minister of India, the President of the Philippines and so forth. And at the end of the day, it seems like these communities didn't go for the micro-targeting, and they sort of voted like the mainstream and didn't vote on issues that were particular to their communities, or did they? Did they vote on issues of, say, Canada's relations with India or Israel or anything else? Or do they just vote like everybody else who didn't have a sort of foreign or ethnic particular set of concerns?
I mean, first of all, clearly I think, I mean, just basic evidence of where MPs were elected, I mean, they seem to have voted, in great proportion for the Liberal Party of Canada. But I think what's important to say, I think a lot of I mean, this is not, this sort of vote per se is not my area of expertise, but my understanding from my colleague or work on these issues is that we especially in the press, overestimated in the last few elections the extent to which immigrants were increasingly voting for the Conservative Party. I mean, the situation had perhaps improved, but all things being equal, they were still more likely to vote for the Liberal to a certain extent. So I think we can't overestimate the extent to which there have been shifts. Now, we're going to have to see my colleague who do the Canadian election studies and sort of look at what their conclusions are. But I'm just going to speculate a little bit based on the electoral campaign and some findings of other study. My friend Steve White has done a study trying to understand why historically immigrants in Canada, especially after the 1960s, tended to vote the Liberal Party. And there's a number of hypotheses in literature. That's because of the time they arrived, who was in power. It's because of certain policies. And it finds most of them didn't work. And sort of his hypothesis that he sort of indirectly tests is that essentially, and I think it applies historically to Catholics in the 19th century, is that they vote for, if they find that the sort of the welcoming community, so all Canadians vote a certain way, and people who tend to be more open to immigration vote for a certain party, they tend to vote for that party also. I think that's sort of what Stephen has found. So one of my hypotheses is that independent of her view on things like the NICAB, for example, I mean, I have difficulties not being very critical of the Barbaric Act outline. Personally, I think that was not the finest moment of the Conservative Party of Canada. But I think my sort of gut feeling, so it's really not scientific, but my gut feeling is that many immigrants in Canada, independent of their views, their political views on certain parties, were really turned off by sort of the fact that those issues were constantly being brought during that election. And I think personally, I would think it really backfire on the Conservative Party. But again, this is based on just sort of my reading of what happened during the election. So we haven't seen the data yet, so we'll have to see using sort of the Canadian election studies and also things like the Boussole. And now we have way more resources. The Boussole Electorale, they raise a lot of data, so we'll have to see what happened. But you know, ultimately, I think it's for political parties, you want to build on the long term in terms of relationship with groups and communities. So we have to be aware. If I were, you know, I'm not involved in partisan politics, but if I was giving advice to party would be, you have to be careful of just short-term strategy. You want to build for the long term.
The other thing I would say is that I'm not particularly concerned about whether micro-targeting worked or not, because I would want to hope that micro-targeting is not just about increasing your constituency, but also trying to decrease the distance between immigrant groups and institutions. What concerns me is more about the fact that micro-targeting only happened for large communities that have electoral weight, and it didn't happen for small-sized communities that are equally as important in terms of their weight for the Canadian population. So that's what concerns me most about, as opposed to whether partisan tactics worked or not. I can only take one more question because we need to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you, since you haven't.
Thank you. I want to ask about narratives and language. So narratives such as we saw in the last 2 federal elections when somebody young who gets voted into office for whatever circumstances, the news media and the stories and the narratives generally focus on their youth, their inexperience, the fact that, you know, they don't have much life experience or professional, you know, experience to speak of. When, you know, we saw that there was a particular effort to have this newest cabinet represent Canada a bit more, all of a sudden there's a lot of narrative around meritocracy. So the insinuation there is, you know, perhaps young people didn't earn their spot, perhaps people of different backgrounds or color or women didn't earn their spot. And then on the language side, you know, we still use words like ethnic vote or minorities, even though in certain places, you know, I'm thinking of Toronto, where over half the population is not born in Canada, or Sarah, your own stat from Brampton, 61% of South Asian descent, but we're still using these very you know, terms that kind of bring to mind a certain kind of thinking. Your thoughts on this, you know, narratives, language, is this a problem? Is it contributing to the problem? And if so, how can we change this moving forward?
Well, I'm not sure that removing that language would help to eliminate the problem. And I always cite the example of France, where racial categories have been abolished. It doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist in France, right? You're right that demographically, minorities aren't really minorities in many settings. Unfortunately, in the social and political realm, in terms of their social visibility, they are minorities. And so sometimes calling vulnerability for what it is helps us to look at it as a problem and think about ways that we can address it. In terms of narratives that are used to describe candidates, that's another interesting debate, right? And the entire discussion about how visible minority candidates are portrayed in terms of representing their community as opposed to representing the entire population, whereas generally white candidates are portrayed as representing everybody. That's another very problematic narrative that I haven't studied, but I know it exists. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but yeah, narratives do matter a lot. I am not sure, though, that changing the way we call minorities will actually help us, will reduce the issues.
Yeah, but I think your point on, especially the notion of ethnic vote, which I think is meaningless in any case. I mean, which group are we talking about in any? So I tend to agree with you that these are sort of problematic view. I mean, what's the impact of sort of thinking of presenting this way? That actually is something that would be interesting in discussing. I just want to make maybe a comment on the youth aspect that you mentioned at the beginning about earning their stripe and so on and so forth. And those kind of discourse are often mentioned. And I think we had a recent example when MP from Calgary, Michelle Rempel, sort of on Twitter kind of said, you know, was sort of musing about the possibility of running for the leadership, and just people were like very critical, you know, you're too young, well, and there was obviously the gender issue on top. So I do think those are fairly problematic. Now, one of the things, though, I'm interested to see, and why I'm sort of I'm looking forward to see the sort of voter turnout for young people this election was, on the one end, on the other end, you know, a lot of young people were elected at the previous election, mostly in Quebec because of the orange wave. So on the other end, I think we are at a time, or we've been at a time in Canadian politics, where it seems to me that there's a generational renewal, which I think is sort of a good thing. And one of the important difference between Canada and the US that is not enough mentioned is the last, you know, the incumbency rate, that, you know, the people who are re-elected in the US, the last congressional election in the US, I think was 95%. So it's barely any sort of generational replacement. Now in Canada, I think the last election was 60% of incumbent were re-elected. So I think in Canada, we do have a political system that allows for sort of gradual generational replacement, which I think is a good thing in general. And I think, you know, Mr. Trudeau, to his merit, I think has has made some room in his cabinet for fairly young member of his caucus. Now, the extent to which that sort of has a broader cultural impact, I'm really not sure. But certainly, I think I find that sort of interesting what is happening in Canada in terms of having a generational change, at least in terms of leadership.
Just one last remark, that I think part of the issue with categories like ethnic vote or and such categories has to do with the way we collect the data as well, right? So very often we collect data in ways that doesn't actually allow us to have a more fine-grained understanding of who is the ethnic population, and as a result of that, we call everybody ethnic because we don't know who they are and how different they are from each other. So that kind of points out to an issue in the way we collect data.
But it's hard also.
It's hard.
To get the sort of the sample size, I mean this is technical stuff, but to get the sample size to be able to do the sort of comparison between different, because Michael Chong before, and I absolutely agree, at the end he says, you know, we have to differentiate communities, which is absolutely true. And I absolutely agree. I think it's just hard as researcher to be able to do that because it requires a lot of money, basically. But hopefully the new government is going to increase SHRC money, so we have more money to do research.
Okay, so thank you everybody for your engagement. You made this session extremely interesting, and no pun intended. I have to remind you that we have a book launch starting in half an hour. And for those of you who would like to attend, and I encourage you to attend, we'll be meeting at the entrance in the lobby at 4:30, so right away. Thank you for attending, and I hope you'll all enjoy the book launch as well. Thank you.
Thank you.